Chapter 19. Prisoners! The woman at the foot of the cliff was dressed in trousers, a jacket, and wore a man's felt hat pushed back on her head. Straight gray hair streamed to her waist. She was digging. Some distance away was a tiny log cabin built near the foot of the mountain. Alongside it, an Appaloosa pony was tethered. "This woman doesn't look like a witch," Louise said finally. "She's actually pretty, and she has a very sweet face." By this time, Mr. Strong had joined the Danas. He looked down and blinked in astonishment. "The story about the witch was true," he said. "The strange woman does live here." "But she doesn't look like a witch," Louise insisted. "She looks very kind." "Don't forget, she has a reputation for being handy with a gun," Mr. Strong reminded the girls. "I see she has a rifle lying right alongside her." "I'm going to speak to the woman anyway," Louise said resolutely. "We promised ourselves we'd try to help her." "All right, but be careful," the rancher advised. "I suggest we all lie on our stomachs and peek over the bench, so if she does take a pot shot at us, we can duck." The three got down and peered over the edge. In a friendly tone, Louise called, "Hello, Miss Carmino." The woman gave a start and looked up. At the same time, she grabbed her rifle, ready for action. "Please put down your gun," Jean requested. "We're not going to bother or harm you. Aren't you Miss Blanche Carmino?" The stranger did not answer the question, but in a low, cultured voice she said, "I never heard a friend. Who are you?" The Danas and Mr. Strong stood up. Louise went on, "We want to be your friends. We're two sisters from the east, hunting for our dog, which is lost in these mountains. This kind rancher has been guiding us on our search." Jean added, "Our dog is a beautiful German shepherd. We thought he might have headed in this direction." "Tell me more about him," the woman said. The girls described Baron Otto von Neckar. Then they introduced themselves and Mr. Strong. When the lone inhabitant of Lost Lake did not answer, the rancher gave her a big reassuring grin. "You might say we're neighbors, even though some distance apart," he observed. "So we certainly would like to know how to address you properly." Suddenly she laughed in a musical voice. "Yes, I am Blanche Carmino. Please come down. I would like to talk to you." Delighted, the trio slid down the sloping rocky wall until they reached the foot, then walked across the open space to where Miss Carmino had been digging. When they reached her, she shook hands with each of her callers. "Follow me," she suggested, and headed toward the cabin. They had barely started when from the back of the small building came a joyful bark. Louise and Jean, excited, started to run. They rounded the corner of the building and gave cries of delight. "Baron!" they shouted. "We found you!" The dog appeared to be in fine condition. He leaped about, straining at the chain which held him fast. He wagged his tail furiously and kept on barking. Louise and Jean took turns hugging the German shepherd, who seemed as glad to see them as they were to see him. Mr. Strong and Miss Carmino stood in the background, smiling. Finally, the woman said, "If I had any misgivings about the dogs being yours, I do not have them now." "How long has Baron been here?" Louise asked. "Actually, he has been here twice," the woman replied. "The first time was about a week ago. He seemed absolutely exhausted. I fed him and he slept soundly for hours. Baron is so beautiful, I was hoping he would stay, but he disappeared. I was greatly worried." The Danas nodded understandingly. "We know how you felt," said Jean. "When did Baron return, Miss Carmino?" "The day before yesterday. What a relief to see him safe and unhurt. This time I had a feeling he must be somebody's pet and was lost. I decided to keep him until the next time I went to town, intending to take him along and turn him over to the deputy sheriff. "It's certainly lucky for us," said Jean, "that you decided to keep him." She then told Miss Carmino about the train wreck and how the dog had disappeared. "Our Aunt Harriet will certainly be happy to see Baron." "Yes," Louise put in. "You see, he's a valuable show dog, and we're taking him to New York to his new owner. We would have felt terrible at having to break the news that we had lost Baron." The woman's face took on a worried expression. "I should tell you something else, girls," she said. "Twice in the past 2 days, people have tried to steal him." Excitedly, the Danas and Mr. Strong pressed for details. "First," Blanche Carmino continued, "2 men came sneaking in here night before last. Baron barked loudly, and I went out. When I saw the men going toward him, I shot my rifle into the air, and it scared them off." "But then they returned," Jean guessed. "No," replied Miss Carmino. "Yesterday a man and a woman came." Seeing the Danas and Mr. Strong exchange glances, she asked if they knew the couple. "We're not sure," Louise answered, "but we've met 4 suspicious people in the mountains that could be the ones who tried to steal Baron." Suddenly Miss Carmino glanced at Mr. Strong, who had a somewhat quizzical expression on his face. She smiled charmingly and shrugged her shoulders. "I can see that you think I'm not telling everything." The rancher started to apologize, but she went on cordially. "Please, everyone, come inside the cabin and I will tell you my whole story." Louise and Jean were thrilled. Perhaps at last they were going to learn the secret of Lost Lake. "Thanks, we'd like to," said Mr. Strong. Miss Carmino led them to the front of the cabin. She opened the door to reveal a charming interior. The cozy living sleeping quarters were filled with artistic, handmade rustic furniture. In one corner stood an easel with a half-finished landscape painting on it. The walls were filled with unframed pastels and watercolors of the surrounding scenery and of wild animals. "We heard you once studied at art school," Louise remarked. "Are all these lovely drawings yours?" As Miss Carmino nodded, Jean commented, "They're marvelous! Do you ever sell your work?" Miss Carmino smiled a bit sadly. "I tried to when I visited in New York many years ago, but didn't find any customers. I guess I'd been away from city life too long. It was difficult for me to meet people." She invited her sympathetic listeners to be seated, then continued, "You doubtless have heard of the great earthquake and landslide that devastated this region 40 years ago." "Yes, we have," Jean said, leaning forward in her eagerness to hear Blanche Carmino's next words. "Well," their hostess gave a tremulous sigh. "That disaster changed my whole life so suddenly that it hasn't been until recent years I felt somewhat recovered from the shock." The artist related the sad account of her parents' death. "For a time, my health was broken completely. I just wanted to live here alone and had sufficient money. After a while, I began painting pictures, building this furniture, and digging for artifacts. This seemed to help me." "Did you build the cabin too?" Jean asked. "No, that was here, the only building left in town. No one was here, so I claimed it." The interesting woman went on to say that the Danas and Mr. Strong were the only friendly people she had met in years. The shopkeepers in Huntersville were barely civil to her, and certain impolite people in town annoyed her whenever she went for supplies. Jean diplomatically changed the subject. Recalling that Aunt Harriet had heard of an Antonio Carmino, she took a chance and asked, "Your father, Antonio, was a famous man, wasn't he?" Blanche looked at Jean in amazement. "Yes, he was. That is, in his own field. But how did you know?" Jean grinned and explained Miss Dana's familiarity with Carmino's name. But we still don't know what your father did or why he came to Pueblo Lake. Then I will tell you. The artist said that she and her mother and father once lived in New York City. Antonio Carmino was a sculptor of note, but his health had become very poor, and the doctor had ordered him to move out into the clear, dry air of the Rocky Mountains. Father chose Pueblo Lake because it was so picturesque, she went on. But directly after we arrived, he learned that people in town, although good-hearted, were the hard-working, rugged, practical type and had no use for artists of any kind. She said that in order to avoid gossip, her father had done his sculpting in a secluded cave. There's some very fine, variegated colored rock in this mountain, which he used for his statues. Ever since the group had entered the cabin, Baron had been barking almost continuously. Miss Carmino smiled. I guess the dog wants to be with you. I'll unchain Baron and bring him inside. The artist returned in a few moments with the dog and closed the door. We'll have tea while we talk, she told her guests, and went into a small adjoining room that evidently served as a kitchen. While water was boiling for the tea, she carried in an exquisitely decorated flower tray on which was a tea service of very fine china. Furthermore, the erstwhile witch had combed her hair and arranged it gracefully on top of her head. She really looked very attractive, the Danas observed. You people make me feel like my old self, and using this china I brought from New York is fun, Miss Carmino said, giggling almost girlishly. She served the fragrant tea and some home-baked cookies. Would you like to hear more of my story? The artist asked, as they sipped the beverage. Yes, indeed, Louise replied, at the same time patting Baron, who had stretched out at her feet. Miss Carmino went on. The people who tried to steal Baron are after another big prize. Somehow they found out about my buried secret and want to locate it themselves. Louise and Jean put down their teacups. Both were in a state of suspense and eagerness to hear at last the details of the mysterious area. Those people, I don't know their names, have come here several times. The couple offered money if I would disclose the statue's hiding place. The two men threatened to harm me unless I do, but I never will tell any of them. But I will tell you. At the time of the great landslide and the death of everyone here, I knew from a letter of Mother's that my father had finished several very fine statues. They were in the cave he used as a studio. That is the treasure spot these dreadful men want me to tell them about, so they can steal and sell the masterpieces. What an amazing story, said Louise. Is the cave nearby? Miss Carmino sighed. That's the trouble. I don't know where it is because the landslide buried so many familiar landmarks. For years after I returned here, I was not equal to searching for the statues. Finally, I regained enough strength to start digging, first for the Indian artifacts, and later to locate the cave. That must have seemed an impossible task, Jean remarked. It did, for a long time, Blanche Carmino admitted, and I had to be constantly on guard against snooping people from this area. And then one can't do much digging in the long winters or during heavy rains. The artist went on to say she had recently uncovered some sculpting tools that she knew had belonged to her father. He must have dropped them as he raced for home. They gave me a wonderful clue to the cave's whereabouts. Miss Carmino's face clouded over. Then those unscrupulous men came along. I'm afraid to do more digging now. Excitedly, the Danas inquired what she thought was the buried studio's location. I believe the cave is just at the point where the lake makes a southwest bend. You can't see it from here. My father's studio was so well protected that I am sure his statues are intact." "Oh, how I'd love to help you find them," said Jean. Mr. Strong, being more practical, suggested that Miss Carmino tell her story to the authorities, stake a claim on the property, and then have trained people do the digging. "It's a fine idea," Miss Carmino agreed, "but I wouldn't have enough money to pay them. It has always been my idea that if I could locate the cave and see if there's anything inside, then I'd get help." Jean was excited. "Please let us help you dig." "All right," said Miss Carmino, who flushed in anticipation. "I'll show you the way." She led the group to the door and gave it a pull. To her amazement, the door would not open. "This is strange," she said, giving the handle another yank. Mr. Strong stepped forward and offered his help. The door still would not budge. Louise, instantly suspicious the door might have been barred by someone on the outside, dashed to a window. She looked out and exclaimed, "There's a man with a rifle! He's pointing it this way! I can't see his face. His hat's pulled way down." The others ran to her side. One glance, and they had no doubt now as to what had happened. They were prisoners. One or more men had quietly sneaked up and probably secured the door handle with a rope in such a way that the door could not be pulled open from the inside. "That low-down crook is not going to get away with this," Mr. Strong exclaimed angrily. "I'll go out the window after him." Miss Carmino cried out, "No, I won't let you risk your life and that of these girls for my sake. If anyone goes out, I'll be the one." Suddenly, from the other side of the door came a loud, self-satisfied laugh. Then a man called out loudly, "No one better come out if you value your lives. Don't make any trouble and we'll leave you alone. Thanks to the witch, we know where Antonio Carmino's statues are. After we dig them out and take the treasures away, you can leave the cabin, but not before." End of chapter 19.